Welcome to the Trust Factor Radio, bringing you interviews and insights to unlock the power of the subconscious mind to create authority, credibility, and trust. With your host, the Authority Architect and best-selling author, Neil Howe.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is your host, Neil Howe, and today my special guest is Mazyar Hedayat. Mazzy has been practicing law for 25 years and has helped individuals and small businesses throughout the Chicago and the Collier counties solve problems ranging from business startups, management and lawsuits, real estate transactions and foreclosure defense, mechanics, lien issues and construction disputes, probate, succession planning, and heirship disputes. But today we're going to primarily concentrate on bankruptcy, liquidation, reorganization, and maybe some lawsuits as well. Mazyar Hedayat, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Neil. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, you know, there's a lot going on in the world right now. It's the only thing that anybody is talking about, really, is this coronavirus, this pandemic that is causing not only health issues throughout the world, but I think the greater, problem from this is going to be financial issues. So we really want to get into that and see what we're going to be able to do. But before we get going, just give us a 30 seconds introduction to yourself and your firm.
All right. Thank you very much. I received my law degree in 1995. Before that, I got an MBA, or a Master's in Business Administration. My MBA is from the University of Michigan. My law degree is from DePaul University here in Chicago. After that, I set up an independent practice, and since then, have been helping people with all of the subject areas you discussed. Fell into bankruptcy relatively early, and I'll tell you why, because it's kind of an interesting story. I went to business school at the tail end of the 1980s, so between 1988 and 1990. The interesting thing about that period is that a lot of the business mergers and acquisitions and so on that had been taking place earlier in the 80s during the Reagan era started to fall apart. And all of a sudden, and I was not a law student at the time, I was a business student, but I noticed that bankruptcy kept getting mentioned, and I found myself more and more interested in finding out, well, you know, how are these business combinations now being unwound? And I went to law school, and when I got out, I knew that I would have an interest in finding out more about that, both for businesses and for individuals. And once I started doing it, and I did covered all these other areas as well, but once I started doing it, I would say it was, I guess, around the subprime crisis, basically 2005, 6, 7, 8. All of a sudden, I mean, bankruptcy just took over the world. It took over my practice. And I was doing it intensely for a good 10 years. So I've been in the thick of it, individual, corporate. Probably my biggest reorganization client, my biggest corporate client, had, I think, $99 million in revenue. That was a retail company with stores all over the country. But, their needs, in essence, are similar to the needs of any bankruptcy client. And you're 100% right that COVID-19 or coronavirus is absolutely driving the economy right now. It's driving practices like mine.
Right. And you've been there, you've seen it all, you've been practicing law for 25 years. And, like you said, through the Great Recession that we had, 2008, 2009, you've really seen a ton of bankruptcies. I think what's going on right now is going to dwarf that in comparison. We're looking at a huge, big mess in the years to come. How do you see things shaping out, in the immediate term and then the long term as well?
All right. Well, Great question. Here's what I think is going to happen. Obviously, everybody is going to, and you and I are speaking on April 1st. I answered a question similar to this in March, so some of my answers might sound slightly dated. What I said back then is people are going to try to maintain business as usual, as if this were a dip in the market or something. Then they're going to find their hours reduced, or they're going to find themselves completely laid off. Then they're going to start eating through their savings. I mean, this is a pattern that someone in my field is well familiar with. It happens for individuals. It happens for companies. Once they come to the tail end of their savings or the tail end of any kind of unemployment compensation or whatever may be happening, some will have the foresight to consult someone like me and do a little bit of research maybe on their own early. Others, and I've seen this, others will literally wait until the last minute and it will be a mad scramble, but they will eventually say, okay, what are my options? Literally, those are the three words you hear more than any. What are my options? So again, near term, they're eating through their savings. Near to intermediate terms, they may be getting some benefits from the government, and I have to tell you, I'm skeptical about benefits from the government, because think about it, it's the government. They've never done anything quickly or timely. So you could get a benefit from the government, but it comes in 2 months after it was promised. Well, that's not what you need. So in the intermediate term, they're going to run out of resources, and then finally into the future, and for the foreseeable future, I should tell you. I mean, I'm not just talking about what's going to happen in 3 months. I'm saying starting in a month or two, and then going on for a good year at least. They're going to need debt relief. If they still have a job with regular income, they can reorganize. This is for individuals. Job with regular income, they can reorganize. A reorganization allows them to hold on to all or most of the assets that they have. If they no longer have an income, and of course that's what COVID is doing to the economy. If they no longer have an income, they're going to need protection from their creditors, so they're going to need to liquidate. Reorganization and liquidation come with a whole, each has a unique set of outcomes. And these same two sets of outcomes, liquidation and reorganization, it's exact same for a business of any size. Obviously, it's much more complicated and much more expensive when you're talking about a business, but it's the same set of needs. If you have regular income coming in, whatever the source, it might be, might be residual income, it might be products that you've sold in the past, whatever it is. You can use that income to make a compromise with creditors from your past and move on into the future. But again, COVID is a catastrophic event. And the hallmark of catastrophic events like this is that people have no options. So they must liquidate. So that's where we stand.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horrible place to be in. And, I think people right now are just saying, okay, well, we get a little bit of time off, or, sheltering in place, we're staying at home, we're getting a break, but realization probably hasn't hit in yet. Once, they go through that process, it's, kind of, all right, business as usual. I've got a little bit of time off. Well, my hours are reduced, but I can file for unemployment, so that will keep me going for a little while. But then, they start getting into their savings and realizing that they don't have anything left. They're looking for options, and then they're talking to people like you and needing that relief. The question is, when do you think that is going to kick in?
Well, it depends on, the fact is it depends on the burn rate. That is to say, what their usual monthly expenses are, and it depends on what benefits are delivered by the government. I'm going to give you a real example, and I'm going to keep it anonymous to preserve, people's privacy. But I just this morning, before I started talking to you, I was having a Twitter discussion with an old friend of mine, and who happens to have a very comfortable corporate job. And he was saying how people are exaggerating the current situation. And I had to point out to him that he was saying this as someone with a comfortable corporate job and a very comfortable corporate pension. And I'm sure he's being paid, even if he's working from home or even if he's temporarily not working, he's being paid because he has a big corporate job.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't have that.
No.
Most people, as the saying goes, can't come up with emergency funds to pay down an unexpected $400 or $500 expense. Well, to say that the COVID-19 situation is a disaster for those people is not an exaggeration. It really is. So,
and we're talking about a lot of the service-based industries that rely on that money coming in week to week just to get by. And, I think the last figures that I saw was like that's about 40% of the working population that are now looking to unemployment just in order to get by.
That is 100% true. And we're talking about everybody. Look, the economy had a fundamental shift. I want to say 20 years ago. And, I hate to use this analogy. Some people will call it an exaggeration, but look, if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, he'll squeal. It'll be painful. But if you turn the heat up just a few degrees at a time, eventually the frog will be cooked. He won't realize it. Well, starting originally, 40 years ago, I would say, little by little, things started offshoring, and stable jobs with stable incomes started to be eroded. That's accelerated in the past 20 years until, we now have a term that we never used to have before, gig economy. What is the gig economy? These are people who, they're independent contractors. There's no job security. There's no pension. And, there's no security of any kind. These people literally live on a knife's edge. Well, COVID-19 comes along, and their opportunities dry up. Again, not an exaggeration. That is a cataclysmic event, which is why I referred to the discussion I had earlier with my Twitter friend. I wish him well, obviously, but I just kind of shook my head. I don't think someone in that position can possibly understand what we're talking about. This is the literal end of the world. What are these people going to do?
Mm-hmm. That's the big question. What are they going to do? Because, even if this lasts, it's been a month almost now, but if it goes on and lasts, 2 months anyway, the country coming to an economic standstill almost for 2 months is going to have repercussions for years. And, like you said, after the recession, you've been, doing bankruptcy nonstop for almost 10 years. What's it going to look like in the next 5-10 years in this country?
I tell you what, it's going to look just like it did back then. It's going to look just like it did. And the period I'm talking about is 2008 to 2018. Basically, that 10-year period, there was a tidal wave of bankruptcy work. And what goes with bankruptcy work, I mean, it's stress. So bankruptcy is often a precursor to or a result of a foreclosure. And events like that combined often precipitate or are precipitated by a divorce. I mean, and I hate to say this, but this is, again, in my experience, I've actually experienced situations where a combination of the factors that I just described led to someone doing something drastic. In one case, one of my clients took his own life, and what had been a bankruptcy turned into a what's known as probate, so administering his estate, which we also do. So, cradle to grave. And that sounds terrible in this circumstance, but really, my office handles things from cradle to grave, from business startup to business bankruptcy, which is the equivalent of business death, and when necessary, probate and divorce and foreclosure and things like that. So these are the things that happen under stress, and if you add to that an actual life-threatening disease, again, it surprises. I'm dumbfounded when people are somehow sanguine about this. If they sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, the administration is doing what it can, that is not an adequate response, in my opinion.
Right.
I mean, and I don't mean to turn this discussion into anything political, but I don't know. It is what it is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, real or perceived, the problem is there, and it's having the financial implications that it is having. And like you said, rightly so, there's going to be a lot of divorces. There's going to be a lot of suicides because of this. And, it's I mean, we've kind of exacerbated the problem here, and there's still a lot to talk about that, we haven't mentioned. But let's get to some of the solutions for individuals who need to file bankruptcy. Like, what's their options and what's the first steps for them?
Sure. Well, luckily, bankruptcy really is a solution. It will really do the job. And as I mentioned, the same two basic routes are available for both individuals and companies, and they are liquidation and reorganization. Liquidation means essentially your debts have overwhelmed your ability to pay, not just your ability to pay, but your assets. So this happened a lot, for instance, during the subprime crisis back around 2008 and so on, when someone said, well, my house was worth $200,000 when I bought it, but now the value has fallen. My mortgage hasn't changed, but the value's fallen. Someone in that situation could easily justify liquidating, meaning they would say, listen, this house is not worth what you think it is, and, as far as I'm concerned, you can take it. So those kind of people were out there. That's a liquidation. The other option was the person who said, listen, I have a job. It provides enough for my family and I to get by, but often something happens that's a little more incremental. Maybe it's, we never expected this many credit cards, or illness. Many times illness is a precipitating factor. And what they say is, listen, I still have income, and I want to hold on to my house. I want to hold on to my car. I don't need to sort of turn everything in and walk away. All I need is a little more time to pay my debts on favorable terms. So that is your other option. Your first option was liquidation. And the example I use for people who actually come to my office is a little visual aid. I sort of take a cup with the marbles in it, let's say. You turn it over, and all the marbles come out, that's your liquidation. Whatever you have that has value, there's someone whose job it is to assess that, sell the property, distribute the proceeds. They're known as a trustee. The other option, the liquidation, says, hey, listen, you don't have to give away any of the marbles. You can hold on to your house, you can hold on to your car, no problem. All that's going to happen is the people you owe money to, you're now going to have a payment plan. As long as you have regular income, you have to pay your living expenses and pay a little more, and that little extra is going to pay these people off. And you have a 5-year period in which to do that with no interest. I mean, it's really the most favorable type of thing you can find. And one thing that's important to note, and I'm proud of this. People come to my office and you know, in all sincerity, they say, "Will my case succeed?" I'm very proud to say, if I take your case will succeed. Okay, so that's at least one thing it's one less thing for people to worry about. Now, it's a different question to say, do they qualify? Some people will qualify for liquidation. Some people will only qualify for reorganization. And that, by the way, that is... Sorry, go ahead.
There's limits on the liquidation is a Chapter 7, and there's limits on who can qualify for that. What's the distinguishing factor between that and Chapter 13 that is a reorganization?
Yeah, well, let me tell you about that. Again, having practiced as long as I have, my practice reaches back to a time when there were not such limits. The limits that we're about to talk about were introduced during the Bush administration, that era, by essentially by lobbyists. And it was known as an amendment to the Bankruptcy Act. It was called the Bankruptcy, BAP-CIPA, they call it. And BAP-CIPA was essentially written by lobbyists, but it's the law. And what it does that had never been done before is they said, listen, we're not going to permit everybody to file Chapter 7 liquidation anymore. We're simply not. And that was unheard of. What they said was the distinguishing factor will be whether someone makes at or below the median income for that state and that jurisdiction. So as you can imagine, this sort of created a whole new bureaucracy around determining, well, so I'm in Illinois, for instance. How much do people in Illinois make? What is the median income? Median income for one person, 2 people, a family of 4, and so on. There are all these newly introduced limits. And if you make less than that, and by the way, the limits are not particularly generous. What you and I might think of as the average income or median income may be higher than what the government considers the median income. So before you know it, you may say, gee, I barely feel like I can pay my bills. But the government says, no, you make enough. You make enough to pay your bills and pay your debts. I mean, over time. Well, that may be patently untrue, but that's the standard. The standard is whether you make at or below the median income in your state. So that's one of the limits on your Chapter 7.
So let me ask you this, Mazzy, for the people that, you know, make a decent amount of money, they've got a standard of living. You said divorce was one of the main issues that people come to you for help. You know, what does the outcome of that look like for, you know, both parties?
Well, if someone is, let's call them upper middle class, if they actually make above the median income and they make a sufficient amount, the Chapter 13 reorganization, and by no means do I mean to imply that Chapter 13 is a happy outcome. It isn't. But one thing about Chapter 13, I often call it the invisible bankruptcy, because if someone's in Chapter 13, what it really means is that their personal budget, their family budget, has to be squeezed, but they get to keep their property. So your neighbor could be in Chapter 13. They'd still have that house. They'd still have that car. Their kids would still be going to local schools. You wouldn't know it. So Chapter 13 is a way to sort of keep things together, as long as you have that regular income coming in. And, not to descend once again into an anecdote, but again, this morning before you and I spoke, I got a call from a client of mine who's been in Chapter 13. Now, Chapter 13 is generally a 5-year plan, 60 months. She called me and said, well, we haven't spoken in a while. My husband and I are getting divorced. We're separated. I lost my job 6 months ago. Those are the things that can upend the reorganization. But if you can, and under those circumstances, 5 years can seem like a long time. But if you can keep things together for those 5 years, you're in the clear. It'll even restore your credit. I should say that. Both kinds of bankruptcy have, believe it or not, it's going to seem counterintuitive. Both kinds of bankruptcy can have a salutary effect on credit. And the reason is a Chapter 7 liquidation eliminates your debts. And of course, the average credit score, or FICO score, named for the Fair Isaac Corporation, a FICO score is essentially a ratio of income or assets to debts, or debts to income and assets. Anyway, when the debt portion of the ratio is eliminated, all of a sudden you look much better to creditors, to credit card companies, to lenders. You have no competing debts. That's a liquidation. In a reorganization or Chapter 13, the reason that can have a salutary effect on credit is that Chapter 13, by its nature, is a payment plan. And if you're complying with the payment plan, as long as you're in compliance, it's, as opposed to back when you owed too much in credit card debt, you owed too much in this and too much of that, you couldn't make your payments on time. As long as you're making your Chapter 13 payments, it's restoring your credit. So, now as far as the more extreme elements, whether it's divorce or suicide, unfortunately, something like that, that's unique to human psychology. But I will tell you, and this is anecdotal, but it's coming from somebody who's seen these situations. Many times, divorces occur because the wives kind of feel like they put their future in the hands of their husbands. And if things are not going well financially, they feel as if their husband failed them, if you will. And that's usually what precipitates that.
Well, definitely finances. Yeah, finances are definitely one of the leading causes of divorce, if not the leading cause of divorce. So it is extremely important to make sure that you get all the help that you need. Talk to me about some of the myths or misinformation that people might have about filing a bankruptcy.
Okay. Well, I would say the number one misconception about bankruptcy is that it's a failure. Essentially, you're yielding, you're giving up. That's not true at all. Bankruptcy is merely a technique. Our current president famously used bankruptcy with several of his ventures. Henry Ford, which is an example that I prefer to Donald Trump, but Henry Ford, his company went bankrupt 3 times before it finally got off the ground permanently. I'm talking about the Ford Motor Company. The point is, bankruptcy is merely a tool. So one misconception people have is that bankruptcy is the end of the line. It is not the end of the line. The other misconception that people have is that, bankruptcy means sort of stereotypical picture of the guy walking out wearing a barrel and two straps over his shoulders, and turning out his pockets and he has nothing in there. There are exemptions in bankruptcy. The bankruptcy system allows you to keep what is considered to be sort of a necessary minimum amount of things. And depending on what state you're in, so for example, I'll take Florida, for example. Florida, there is no limit on the value of the home that you can maintain. As long as you can keep paying the mortgage, if you live in a $40 million estate, you can declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy and remain in the home. There's no limit. Now, here in Illinois and in most states, things are not nearly that generous. But but the misconceptions people have are what they'll have to give up and whether they'll have anything left afterwards. So bankruptcy is frightening. It's like going to the dentist. How do I know I don't have any cavities? I don't go to the dentist. No one's ever told me.
Right.
So, okay, but no, don't. So I personally always try to be as, I always try to explain as much as possible, and I always try to be as approachable as possible. Even if someone's contacting me, it's not necessarily for something that's going to happen today. It's not even necessarily for a case. I just try to provide information. The more you know, the more comfortable you can be with it.
That's right. Now, for people that, might be thinking about it in the back of their mind and, they've gone through this little process or they're halfway through the business as usual, the hours are reduced or the unemployment, they're looking at their savings. At what point should they be contacting you, and what stops them from contacting you until it's, too late?
Well, people are by their nature, all people are by their nature, especially Americans, are resilient and optimistic. And those are great qualities as long as you don't cross the line and go from resilient and optimistic to to foolhardy. In other words, somebody will say, hey, listen, I've gone through tough times before. Just because coronavirus is here doesn't mean I won't get back on track. Or the government has promised that they will do this for me, so surely they will. That kind of thinking, which can be vindicated from time to time, of course, when the government says we're going to give you money and they give you money, great. But if taken too far, it's just an issue of misplaced faith, which becomes denial of the facts. So if your spouse tells you, honey, we haven't been able to pay this bill on time for this long, if you were taking a perfectly objective view, you would say, okay, that's an indicator that we're having an issue. What's the problem? What can we do about it? Businesses often take that kind of analytical approach, although between you and me, not all businesses do that. I've seen many small businesses that are run, unfortunately, by the seat of the pants. But people in their own lives almost never take such an analytical view. What stops people from calling me is they say, I don't need to call a bankruptcy lawyer. That's the last resort. Of course, bankruptcy is the last resort, but it doesn't hurt to find out. At least learn about what would happen should that be needed. And by the way, the same thing goes for foreclosure. Many times. And I cannot blame anybody for being optimistic and believing in themselves and saying, you know what, I've come through tough times before. I'm going to come through this. I have a tendency to be that way myself. But the fact is, there's no shame in asking for help. If I'm sick,
that's right. That's right. And I think there's a lot of people there that are going to need help. They're going to need their questions answered. And each situation is unique also. So it is important that you get individual help and attention. Mazzy, people want to reach out to you, what is the best way for them to do that?
I am available by email, phone, and text. So I am as available as I can be. Maybe the first step is to go to our website, www.mha-law.com. You can get in touch with me that way, www.mha-law.com. Our phone number, 630-378-2200. That's 630-378-2200. And people can also text that very same number, 630-378-2200. And they can get a hold of me that way. Also, by going to our website, you can set up an automatic appointment, whether it's a phone appointment or you want to come into the office or whatever. We have a sort of an automated calendar that can help you do that. We are as accessible as possible. You can also find me on Yelp, and Twitter and Facebook and the usual places. Look up my name and you'll find us.
Excellent. Well, we're talking with Mazyar Hedayat, M Hedayat and Associates. That's mha-law.com. And Mazzy, thanks very much for being my guest on the Trust Factor Radio today.
Thank you for your time today, Neil. I really, really enjoyed the interview.
And to our listening audience, if you like what you hear, hit that like button and share, and we'll see you next time on the show.
You've been listening to the Trust Factor Radio with Neil Howe. To learn about the resources mentioned in the show and to listen to past episodes, go to thetrustfactorradio.com. To get a copy of the book, The Trust Factor, go to thetrustfactorbook.com. If you are ready to act now and build your authority, credibility, and trust, schedule a consultation with Neil at theauthorityarchitect.com.